Thank you all for joining us. I see one of the attendees is a former student, and Stephanie, lovely to see you here. As Kelsey mentioned, first of all, thank you to Kelsey for organizing this and for inviting me to speak. I am not just with a kind of the fine print, the disclaimer here is I am not a historian of Ukraine. I am a historian specializing in Soviet history. So I do 20th century Russia. So I do know a bit about Ukraine. I also have personal connections to this part of the world that I'll mention later on. Nor am I a diplomat or a foreign or a political scientist. So I'm not the best person to ask for an assessment of where things stand and where things are necessarily going, though I have some thoughts on that. Which is why my topic is my focus today is really on history and its use and weaponization in the light of this conflict. What we see is the emergence of different contradictory historical narratives that are being used by multiple sides in this conflict in order to frame the current situation and to justify, particularly in the case of the Putin regime, to justify what is going on and to kind of explain the roots of this conflict. And I think as informed citizens, it's important for us to be aware to understand where these historical references are coming from and why they're being used, and also to be aware of when they're being misused, because there's a lot of that going around as well. So I will share my screen here. Kelsey, can you see my PowerPoint? Okay, great.
It's perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so just wanted to start off by mentioning that just 2 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian State Duma, which is the Russian parliament essentially, introduced a bill which attached fines and prison sentences to a 2021 law banning, and this I'm quoting here from the translation of the bill, any public attempt to equate the aims and actions of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany during World War II, as well as to deny the decisive role of the Soviet people in the victory over fascism. So this raises the question, why is a regime that's about to wage a war worrying about history and passing laws and directives about speech that refers to historical narratives? Why is this important? And the reason is, I would argue, is that history and very misuses of history, as I mentioned, is a big part of the toolbox of particularly the Putin regime, and it's very, very political. So I'm going to focus on a couple of what I refer to as kind of historical misnarratives or false historical narratives that the Putin regime has been using to legitimize the conflict. One is this idea that Ukraine does not have the right to exist and it should be a part of Russia. And he said on February 24th, specifically, that Ukraine was created by Lenin in 1917 and again does not have the right to exist as a sovereign state. The other false narrative that you might have seen flying around is this idea that contemporary Ukraine is dominated and ruled by Nazis, and Russia's invasion is a continuation of its World War II mission to denazify Europe. And you'll see this references to denazification if you look around the articles and speeches that and statements that Putin has made. Again, these are both really false, very problematic narratives. Both of them are wrong. And I focus on them, obviously, not to give them credence, but to explain where they're coming from and why they're important. And this is from Putin's, this is the quote that I was referring to from Putin's speech on February 24th. He has said that the people living in what has been historically been the Russian land have called themselves Russian and Orthodox Christians, and modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, he stated, or to be precise, by Bolshevik Communist Russia in 1917. So again, Putin is saying Ukraine is not a sovereign, should not be a sovereign state. We created it, and essentially we can uncreate it, according to him, and that's exactly what he says that he's doing. Now, why is Putin making this statement? The reason he's making it is that he believes that it gives him a strong legitimizing argument to justify this war. But where it comes from is the reality that Russian and Ukraine and Russia's histories are cultures and peoples are deeply entangled and have been closely entangled and connected with one another for centuries, literally for 1,000 years. Of course, this does not mean that Ukraine does not have the right to exist as a separate state. I mean, we have connections to our neighbor. We have close connections to our neighbors as well. That doesn't mean that their sovereignty is illegitimate, but it does provide an opportunity for someone like Putin to make this argument. One of the key points of contact between these two populations is Kievan Rus, a state that existed in the 11th century, really, 11th century to 12th century, which is the first political entity to exist in the Russian lands. And this, as you can tell from the name, Kievan Rus its capital was the city of Kiev, the capital of contemporary Ukraine. The roots of the Russian Orthodox Church, Russia was Christianized by Prince Vladimir of Kiev. So Kievan Rus was the political entity that made Russian Orthodoxy a state religion. And like the cathedral that you're seeing there, which is Saint Sophia Cathedral, Kiev is kind of at the heartland of, or the capital of Russian Orthodoxy. So the fact that Russia's religion was Russian Orthodoxy became the state religion, became Russian Orthodoxy really in Kiev, and because Russia dates its founding as a state to Kievan Rus, this is why this moment in history has been referenced in the past few weeks, and is been used and manipulated by the Putin regime to claim that Kiev should be in fact part of Russia. This is again an excerpt from Putin's essay in July 2021, and again might raise some questions. I mean, Putin is one of these political figures who publishes long historical essays, which, again, is kind of odd to us. I don't think President Biden sits around the White House writing 10-page long historical essays. Why does Putin do this? I mean, he's not a historian, but I mean, I think he imagines himself a historian. But the reason that he does this is that he believes that it's important for his political agenda. And here he writes, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. I'm not going to read all of this word by word, but he talks about the spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir, who is both Prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev, still largely determines our affinity today. So again, we're united. He believes that these Slavic peoples are united by a shared church, shared religion. The throne of Kiev, he argues, held a dominant position in ancient Rus, and this has been the custom since the late 9th century. And he also says, "Let it be the mother of all Russian cities," about Kiev, right? So this historical, religious, symbolic place that Kiev has been a key issue in Russia's recent narratives. And actually, in 2018, again, this conflict has been brewing for some time, certainly since Crimea, the occupation of Crimea in 2014. But the religious aspect of this came to a boil a few years ago when, in 2018, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church officially separated itself from the Russian Orthodox Church and said that it would not recognize leadership in Moscow, and it got the authority from Constantinople to create its own separate church. So that kind of reflects how this political tension has ramifications elsewhere. More important, or not more importantly, but furthermore, over the centuries that followed, Ukraine has been an incredibly diverse area. It has been home to populations including Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, Jews, Cossacks, and it has also been kind of contested by major power players, particularly major empires, including the Russian Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottoman Empire, and the Habsburg Empire. So this has meant, again, this does not mean that Ukraine shouldn't be sovereign, but it has meant that the boundaries have changed dramatically over the centuries, and the areas have been occupied again by different political entities, and that also reflects that also has affected or stems in part from the ethnic diversity of the population. The term Ukraine itself stems from the word for borderland. So this Ukraine's identity in this sense has led to a great deal of cultural richness, but as I said, also has invited and led to incursions from political actors on its borders. One of those incursions was by Catherine the Great. When Catherine the Great in the 18th century expanded Russia and conquered territory to the south, that included much of contemporary Ukraine, and she felt that this territory was so important to the Russian Empire that she created a region there and called it Novorossiya. That means New Russia. So this just gives you a sense of how important she thought this part of this territory was to Russia's identity and Russia's Russia's identity and Russia's political and strategic interests. Ukraine has also historically been an area that's also very economically important because of its natural resources and its fertility. It's often been referred to as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine has held this really important symbolic, cultural, religious, and economic place within the Russian Empire and within the Soviet Union. So this entanglement is reflected in this history. Just to give a quick sense, this is a map that refers to Ukraine in the situation in Ukraine during the First World War, when Ukraine became a battleground between the major battleground in the war. In fact, Ukraine tragically was a battleground both during the First World War and during the Second World War, which led to a great deal of violence and destruction. And in case of the Second World War, destruction wholesale of communities, particularly of the Jewish community. But Ukraine has been sort of at the heart of a lot of these conflicts. And again, you see changing powers. In the wake of the Russian Revolution, it was the first time that a Ukrainian political entity was established. The Ukrainian People's Republic was established in 1917. It was tragically a short-lived entity because of the conquest of the Bolsheviks by 1920. But again, you see here that in this period there was a great deal of changing of hands and great deal of instability in Ukraine as Polish forces, Russian forces, German forces, and local Ukrainian forces tried to control this territory. You may have seen news from the you may have seen the city of Lviv referenced in the news. It is in a major city in Western Ukraine. It is has been a city which has received many refugees from other parts of Ukraine in the wake of this conflict. It is now unfortunately also being targeted by Russian attacks. And Lviv in many ways kind of represents the diversity of this territory, and the fact that it has been under the control of various empires and powers at different times. Lviv was an extremely diverse city with large populations of Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews. This was a major center of Jewish life up until the Second World War. I note there, the city is called Lviv, but it has carried, over the course of history, it has carried many names: Lvov in Russian, Lvov in Polish, Lemberg in German. And as you can see there, it has been under the control of various territories, first as part of the Kingdom of Poland, then under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then as part of the Polish Republic, then part of occupied by the Nazis, and then finally part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and then in contemporary Ukraine. I'm not trying to throw out all of this information to confuse people, but just to give you a sense of the historical changes that these areas and political changes that these areas have seen. So I guess it's what I'm trying to get across here is this the reality that Ukraine has seen, the Ukrainian territories have seen the incursion of various powers, and that they have been at the heart of multiple conflicts, particularly in the 20th century. That it is has historically been a very diverse and a very contested space for various reasons, and that its relationship with, as I mentioned, the relationship with Russia has been very much entangled for almost 1,000 years, and the connections, the connections between these countries and between these peoples and cultures run very deep. In my own family, for example, I was born myself in Moscow, but my father was born in Kiev, and as were his parents, and they considered Kiev their home. My father would travel to Kiev every summer growing up to be with his grandmothers. And my story is very typical in terms of a 20th century family story from this part of the world. My maternal grandfather was born in the city of Artyomovsk, now known as Bakhmut. It is a city in eastern Ukraine, very close to the separatist republics the separatist regions of Donetsk and Lugansk. His family moved to Leningrad in the 30s, or now St. Petersburg. But this family connections, friends connections, work connections across those borders are very, very typical and very, very common in this part of the world, which is one of the things that makes this conflict so painful. Not that every conflict is painful, but it is a case of not perhaps a civil war, but kind of close to it in the sense of the connections between these peoples and these countries. So that is one part of the history that I wanted to cover. The other part of the history is the history of why this history of the Second World War is really relevant here. The history of the Second World War is a huge part of historical memory in the former countries of the former Soviet Union. Former Soviet Union lost, I think estimates go at about 25 million people during the Second World War. This was a major trauma for all of these populations, and it is also an important point of pride in that the Soviet Union played a crucial role. The Soviet Red Army really played a crucial role in stopping in defeating Hitler. So the history of the Second World War is very present for people. they know about it, they think about it. Every family lost someone during the war, and those stories continue to resonate today. Putin has used that relevance and the importance of the war. In fact, the Second World War in Russia is known as the Great Patriotic War. It's not referred to as the Second World War. It's referred to as the Great Patriotic War. Putin has used this history and misused this history. He has instrumentalized the fact that during the Second World War, some elements within the Ukrainian nationalist movements did align with the Nazi regime and were complicit in some Nazi actions. He has used this historical fact to call all Ukrainians, or the Ukrainian leadership, it's not really clear exactly who he's referring to as Nazis, which is completely ridiculous, wrong, and just a completely wild exaggeration. But this has allowed him to attempt to, and in many ways, be successful in convincing his population that what they're doing in Ukraine is a continuation of their World War II agenda in fighting Nazis. But now those Nazis are not Germans, they are Ukrainian. Again, this is just to give you a sense of how ridiculous this is. The president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, is of Jewish background and lost his grandfathers during the Second World War. So, to accuse him of being, and he has said this in his statements, how can you think that I'm a Nazi? Like I lost my own family during the war and fighting the war. But these are just some examples of Russian propaganda during the Crimean crisis, when the people of Crimea were asked to vote on whether they wanted to be part of Russia. These posters were put up, which basically said that the people of Crimea are choosing between either being part of Russia or to be part of Ukraine, which meant being a Nazi, right, or being part of a Nazi regime. So here we have in this poster, you can either be, this is the map of Crimea and the Russian flag inside it, or, again, swastika. This says stop fascism, and saying that voting in the referendum to be a part of Russia would be a way to stop the incursion of fascism. So this is ways in which this and again, these references to denazification, we're fighting Nazis in Russia, in Ukraine, is all over Putin's speeches. It's all over the current propaganda by the Russian regime. On the other side of things, this history is very relevant to, as I mentioned, to all populations in this part of the world, we see Ukrainians and supporters of Ukraine trying to put forward, different historical narratives and make different historical comparisons to explain, to better frame what is going on there. This is just an example of a post by the U.S. Embassy in Kiev in February 24th. I believe it was right around the invasion, which uses Kievan Rus and the fact that Kiev is a much older city than Moscow to push back against this notion that Ukraine is Russian, but in fact to say that Ukraine and Kiev certainly deserve their sovereignty, and in fact that Kiev has the much longer historical and cultural heritage. And we also see multiple examples, many examples of Ukrainians, and again Ukrainian supporters pushing back against Russia's historical narrative and saying that no, in fact what is going on in their view, and I think it's a fair view, is that the conflict we're seeing right now is yet another example of Ukraine and Ukrainian people being victimized, attacked, and targeted by a totalitarian dictator, which has happened previously in the 20th century. So here we see multiple comparisons of Ukraine, of Putin with Hitler. You see there. Here's a poster that I saw just in a very recent Washington Post article of Putin and being compared to Stalin, again referencing Ukraine's victimization and targeting at the hands of the Soviet regime, and then of course Hitler, right? So they're also using these historical comparisons to push, as I mentioned, to push back against Russia's narrative and to indicate the way in which, you know, again, Ukraine is being targeted by these tyrannical power players. These are just some photographs that a friend in Ukraine posted on Facebook, and I shamelessly saved it. I don't think that he would mind, but these are just photographs that he took in Ukraine to, you know, in the past 2 weeks. And again, here you see here comparisons between Putin and Hitler. Putin is sometimes referred to as Putler. So that, again, very clearly drawing that comparison. This is a relatively entertaining poster, but it again frames, it's probably hard to see, but it frames Putin as associated with both the Soviet regime and the Nazi regime, and also this kind of devil that's attacking Ukraine. This is another organization and another post in which, you know, Hitler is being identified as, you know, having taught or Putin's mentor, so to speak, and again, Putin following in Hitler's footsteps. And this is actually just something that that I found is again relevant here, though of a different vein, which, just to give you a sense of how this history has been is relevant, but also in many ways is kind of these recent developments are proving quite shocking to those who are familiar with the history of the Second World War. This was apparently trending on German Twitter, that the German said, "As a German, I just want to get something straight. The entire Western world wants us to build up a huge army, march to Poland, and fight the Russians if needed." Right. So this calling upon Germany to get involved in this, well, really calling upon the rest of the world to get involved in this conflict, but especially with the case of Germany, seeing as Germany has, you know, played such a huge role in occupying, obviously, Ukraine in the 20th century. I don't want to go much further. I just wanted, again, there's a lot to discuss here, but and hopefully some of this information is helpful. This is just kind of an attempt to contextualize and explain some of the historical narratives that you're seeing, and explain where they're coming from and why they're being used by multiple parties in this conflict. I think they're being particularly misinterpreted and weaponized by the Putin regime. I think it helps us better understand some of the roots and some of the ideologies, I guess, behind this conflict, and perhaps helps us to better interpret it and to kind of make our way through all of the noise that is coming out. I did want to end by sharing information about this organization that I know is working out of the Twin Cities. This is an effort on the part of the Ukrainian American Community Center in Minneapolis. They've put together a website called Stand with Ukraine MN, and you can see the web address there, standwithukrainemn.com. And it's just one of the many organizations, but this is a local one that is a great place to go if you want to learn more about this, and also particularly if you'd like to donate or see how you can support Ukrainians and the Ukrainian effort. There are many great organizations out there if that's something that you're interested in doing, and I can recommend a few, but I think this is a great place to start. So I will stop sharing, and and would be happy to answer questions if folks have some questions.
We don't currently have anything in the chat, so I'd encourage people to either put things in the chat or unmute yourself and ask questions.
I have a question about the, I'll put my face here too. It's always nice to see a face. Hi.
Hi.
It's a really complex history because my grandfather came out of the Pale, which was, and so he came out in a little shtetl not far from Kiev. And I've got the name of the town. And so when you look at the map, then it was part of the Russian Empire. So it's a really complex piece because of the number of Jews that were settled there. It's just, I think they say there were over 500,000 Jews living in rural areas in 1882. So, you know, that has to add to the history and the irony of who the president now is of the Ukraine, when that was a place that in 1891, some of the Jews were deported from St. Petersburg in chains into the Pale. So it's really an interesting history for me because it's very personal in some ways. And
absolutely, yeah. Thank you for raising that. I am also of a Jewish background, and my family is from the Pale as well. So I think this kind of adds to the or complexity or richness of the topic, however you choose to see it, is that the area of contemporary Ukraine as well as contemporary Belarus is also the area of or much of Ukraine, particularly central and western Ukraine, is the area of the former Pale Jewish settlement, which was for those who are not familiar with the term, was the area, the heart of the Ashkenazi Jewish community in Europe. So this much of that, you know, and this this again community was particularly victimized and targeted and killed in the course of both the First World War and the Second World War. And that is one of the things that you're really struck with when you go to places like Lviv, as I mentioned, which was an important Ukrainian, Polish, and Jewish center. Jews were a hugely important population in many of the cities, towns of Ukraine, central and western Ukraine, until the Holocaust. A lot of that diversity is now not there anymore because of course, the Nazis, but also Soviet policies as well, and immigration since the Soviet era. So the Jewish community is still there, but it's much smaller. And Zelensky is himself of Jewish background. So it's, you know, again, it's an important part of the history. I think one of the things that really affected me and really is really quite heartbreaking was that one of the targets that one of the sites that was hit by Russian bombings was Babi Yar. Babi Yar is again, for those who are not aware, Babi Yar is the site where 30,000 Kievan Jews were shot over the course of 2 days in September of 1941. It is one of the biggest massacre sites in Europe. And it is also the site where 12 members of my grandmother's family perished. So I do have a personal connection to the site. It is a site where there's been a lot of debate and contestation over the decades since the war about how to commemorate that site. And just 6 months ago, in September of 2021, was the 80th anniversary of the massacre, and there was a large event. There was the new memorials have been constructed at that site, and President Zelensky spoke, as well as the presidents of Germany and Israel. And of course, now we see this site, this burial site, this massacre site, this site of great tragedy, and also mourning and memory for certainly for Ukrainian Jews, but for Jews and for Ukrainians. And Jews were not the only people who were killed at this who were killed in Babi Yar. There were thousands of others who were killed, who were targeted and killed there by the Nazis. And we have a regime that bombed this site allegedly in the name of denazification. So how do you make sense of that? It's insane, but it is the world that we're living in, I guess.
We have a question in the chat about your family moving to Leningrad. Can you tell us a little bit more about what brought them there? A little bit more context around that.
Sure. So as was mentioned, Ukraine, as I had said, different parts of Ukraine, just to kind of contextualize a little bit more, different parts of Ukraine were changed borders, as I had mentioned, and actually Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine have some distinct histories, but for much of Ukraine was under the control of the Russian Empire up until 1917, and then much of Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and after 1917. So that that's important to bear in mind. My family, as I mentioned, my paternal grandparents were born in Kiev. My grandfather's family is from Eastern Ukraine, and my grandmother's family was Jewish. They different, basically from the Pale of Settlement. And my grandparents in the 50s moved to Moscow for work opportunities. And that was something that happened all the time because it was all in the Soviet Union, and that's what people did. They went where they could work. It's the same as sort of moving from one state to another in this country. On my mother's side of the family, my grandmother was born in Moscow. As I mentioned, my grandfather was born in Artyomovsk and Bakhmut, and in a Jewish community. His parents, when he was very young, decided to move to Leningrad for greater opportunities. Right, you move to the big city. There's more opportunities for upward mobility, more opportunities for your kids. His father was a photographer and had a studio there, and then after the Second World War, my grandfather and his parents ended up in Moscow. But again, it's a sort, at the time, all of these places were part of the same state, really. So people moving around was very common. In fact, my great grandmother, who helped raise me, and we were very, very lucky to have her for many years, was born in 1914 in Warsaw, Poland, which at that time was part of the Russian Empire. When the First World War broke out, her father weighed his options and decided to move his family to Moscow because Poland was because of the threat of being in the battleground in Warsaw, and that's how she ended up in Warsaw. Her parents spoke Yiddish. They spoke Russian with an accent. So again, talk about entangled histories.
Thank you. For those that maybe didn't hear us before, you're welcome to unmute and ask questions you might have or put things in the chat, and I'm happy to read them off.
Dr. Belsky, I have a question regarding the sort of that general area with Poland, Ukraine, Russia. As you and I have talked about before, I mean, the history of that area is so fraught with conflict, and it's been so much go back and forth. With Poland being so open to Ukrainian refugees, do you think that puts them at greater risk if Russia expands their military operations, or do you think that Russia is so focused on Ukraine that they'll stop there?
Yeah, thank you. This is actually a question it's a great question. It's come up. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I think that this is, I mean, one of the really encouraging signs that we are seeing is the effort on the part of the global community to help Ukraine, in particular in Poland, which has welcomed Ukrainian refugees, which for those of us who study this part of the world is really encouraging, because over the course of the 20th century, Ukrainians and Poles have fought one another. Lviv is one of the sites where that has happened. So the fact that these two countries are now, or these two, not really peoples, are working together is at least one hopeful sign. I think there's been a lot of discussion of, is Ukraine, what are Putin's plans? The fact that this invasion hasn't gone well for Russia will hopefully deter Putin's ambitions elsewhere. On the 24th, one of the things that struck me in particular in his speech was that Putin basically said that, oh, we'll just go back to pre-1917 borders, which would not just nullify the sovereignty of Ukraine, but would nullify the sovereignty of about 15 other republics, or 16 republics, I'm not counting correctly, which would, just be horrendous, and would involve both NATO and EU countries. Still, so I think that there's the reason for concern, and the Baltic states, Poland and the Baltic states, are all quite worried, and they're worried with good reason. I mean, if I was a political figure there, if I was a leader there, I would be worried too, especially since we've been seeing a very different side of Putin. Something has definitely changed in his policies. So it's very unpredictable. This whole situation has been extremely unpredictable, and that is very worrying. Having said that, I think that Ukraine holds a very special place in Putin's vision, and within the Russian imperial imagination, if to say it that way, within the Russian, if you come from a perspective of Russia's greatness and trying to reassert Russian greatness and trying to reassert a new type of Russian empire, which I think Putin does come from that thinking, Ukraine holds a very special place. It's kind of part of the heartland. I think that Poland and the Baltic states, for example, don't have that kind of interconnectedness that I talked about. Ukraine is much closer to Russia linguistically, culturally, religiously, right? Poland is not. So I think that is important to keep in mind if we as we're analyzing these what's going on. So I think Ukraine is different and it's special. Ukraine, Belarus, in that speech, he said Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, right? These are the Slavic peoples that he sees himself as you representing and as all being, part of a whole. Poles are not part of that vision. So yeah, I would say that, is there cause for worry? Sure, because we don't know what Putin's gonna feel like tomorrow morning. Is there also reason to think that that's not where this is going? Yes.
Thank you. Anybody else that wants to unmute themselves and ask a question?
Yeah, I would like to. First of all, thank you for sharing this with us. This is very helpful. Also, I'm interested in the separatist regions. How do the Ukrainians view those regions? The Russians clearly sounds like they think they're theirs, but how do the people in the separatist areas view themselves? And was there a reason why the lines were drawn where they were when the current state or country of Ukraine was established?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's a question that I know a bit about, but I am not an expert. I mean, one of the reasons that the main reason of the separatist why the Donbass and Lugansk have been at the heart of this separatist movement is that those are the regions that are ethnically and linguistically closer to Russia. In fact, I have to look up the map, so don't quote me on this, but I think close to 50% of people living there are Russian speakers. So this part of these regions in eastern Ukraine, you have more people that identify that. I mean, you have more Russians, right? People that identify with Russia. So that helps explain. I mean, is at the heart of why they're of the separatist movement. In terms of how Ukrainians view those regions, that's a great question. I don't know much about it. I mean, I think they view them as I think obviously they view the separatist movement as a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, because it is, and they are they're frustrated with obviously, and upset about what's been going on there. I think that previous to this, there would have been potentially a chance for this to be negotiated in a way that those regions would be annexed to Russia, because, as I said, there is sort of an ethnic linguistic distinction between the populations in those areas. But the borders were set during the Soviet period. The borders of the contemporary Ukraine are the borders of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic as it existed in the Soviet period. This also helps explain why Crimea is such a mess. In the 1950s, Premier Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, was the leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was Ukrainian from the Donbass, and Khrushchev had previously been the leader of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic before becoming the leader of the Soviet Union. And in a gesture of Khrushchevan goodwill, or whatever it is, Khrushchev was somewhat of an impulsive figure in some ways, not as impulsive as Stalin probably. He gifted Crimea to Ukraine, and that was how Crimea became part of Ukraine. Crimea ethnically is also a bit of a different case in Ukraine. There, it has a Tatar background, a Tatar population that has been decimated historically, but it still exists there. There's a large Russian population there. So that history is also in part why Putin has, in some ways successfully made the argument that Crimea should never really be part of Ukraine. Of course, the other part of that story is that Crimea is a really important strategic place as it sits economically and strategically, because it sits right on the Black Sea. And that's in part why Catherine the Great wanted it to be part of Russia, and why that part of the territory was particularly important for Russian imperial leaders. So it's part of the problem, though, I think, is that people like to point like, well, these borders were, Khrushchev did this, and why should we go by what Khrushchev did in 1950s, or these borders were drawn by the Soviets, do they really matter anymore, or why should we go by those borders? The problem is that once we start doing that, where are we going to end, right? Borders, this is not just a Ukraine problem, right? Borders have moved dramatically and have been drawn by various political actors for various reasons. But if we start down that path, then what are we going to go back to? Is the Roman Empire coming back? I mean, should we give back the Mississippi? Should the United States give back territories to France? I mean, where are we going to end? And I think that's while it's important to understand that history, it's also important to understand that there's a reason that international law says national sovereignty is national sovereignty, and you can't simply say, I don't want to be part of this country anymore. So that's kind of a long way to answer that question. In terms of what people in those separatist regions feel, I think there's a lot of division there between people who, I mean, there is division between those who would prefer to be part of Russia and those who would prefer to be part of Ukraine. There was some polling done recently, and I went to an event about that, but I'm blanking on the specifics at the moment. I think honestly, though, what people there want is to not be in a war zone, right? I mean, they're in what's really not great for the people there is to be in these diplomatic gray area, black hole, when they're like not part of any state, and where they're they're in a war zone. So that's, I think I think the majority of the population want the war to be over, and to have some kind of stability, whether that comes from Russia or from Ukraine. I think is not, certainly not irrelevant, but it may not be the primary issue.
Go ahead.
I wonder if, like the Baltic states, they were sent a lot of, Russians were incentivized to move to the Baltic states to make them more Russian. So do you think that a lot of that might have been why there is so many Russians in the Donbass and the eastern regions and Crimea?
Yeah, I mean, Russians were sent to these regions to kind of Russianize them. I don't know that necessarily Ukraine needed to be, or Eastern Ukraine needed to be Russianized. I think a lot of those people lived there. I mean, a lot of those families lived there for a long time. And the thing is that this question of who's Russian ethnically, who's Ukrainian, is not as clear cut in many families, and that, people might have, my best friend is from Kiev. She went to a Ukrainian language school. Her family has lived in Ukraine, but ethnically identified as Russian at different times. Does that make them Russian? Not really. But so what those, I guess what I'm trying to say in part is like what those terms mean, Russian, Ukrainian, especially at different historic times. I mean, before 1917, they were all subjects of the Russian Empire. Some of them spoke Ukrainian, some of them spoke Russian. In many cases, they spoke both, right? A lot of these, in some places, the bilingualism was certainly the case now in many areas. So it becomes fuzzy, I think, to determine who's who, in particularly when you talk about Eastern Ukraine. But I think you make a really valid point. I mean, one of the scary comparisons that we can draw with the Second World War is that Putin has multiple times made the argument that he's going to war to defend Russian minorities, or he legitimizes his actions by saying he's defending Russian minority populations. This is also an argument that Hitler made prior to the Second World War, where he said, well, I need to annex the parts of Czechoslovakia because I'm defending the rights of German minorities in that territory. Putin has made similar arguments, as I said, regarding Russian minorities. Of course, Russian minorities exist in part of those areas, in part because the Soviets sent them there. So in Crimea, certainly the Tatars were annihilated, were expelled, deported, and then Russians were sent to live there and work there. So that's kind of that's certainly problematic. But then again, once you start the conversation of, well, who has historically lived in this territory, it all depends on what date you set, starting when. And that, that gets complicated when you talk about any part of the world, really.
We have a question in the chat. Does Communist Party membership mean anything anymore in Russia, the Ukraine, Crimea, etc.?
Communist Party membership, I mean, the Communist parties exist in the post-Soviet states. They're they're very much minorities. So I think it's relatively irrelevant. I guess not irrelevant, but it's not. I don't think that it means much. I mean, many people, many older people were members of the Communist Party, during the Soviet period, but few of them continue to identify with that political movement. I think the Communist Party obviously has problems gaining much support because of the fact in Russia, the fact that the Soviet Union fell apart, right, is seen as proof that, well, that wasn't such a great idea, or failed. And in the post-Soviet states, the association is with the Soviet Union, and since the relationship, as an oppressive regime. So that's, you know, it means that it's harder for communists to get much, to have much appeal among those populations.
Anybody else have any questions they were wanting to ask tonight? This is your time.
I want to make sure everyone has a chance before I ask a second one. So I don't want to ask a second unless.
Go ahead, Hillary.
You know, you talked about the two myths, and I understand the second one really clearly about this being a continuation of World War II. And I mean, that one seems like a pretty obvious myth, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the first one, because it was such a complex time. And with Lenin really, he was Jewish. He really welcomed Jews back into Russia. There were a number of Jews, especially in Minnesota, who went back, you know, and to settle there. So if you could talk a little bit more about how that myth on number one was developed because of the complexity of the dynamics, what was going on, that would be really helpful.
So do you mean the myth about that Lenin created Ukraine? That kind of
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I should note quickly, and I kind of thought about adding this, but there's part of the kind of the Second World War myth is this, and its relevance today is this world where genocide is being thrown around, with Putin alleging that there's a genocide against Ukrainian speakers in, Russian speakers in Ukraine, which again is in some ways like dog whistle politics, in that this is a region that has seen genocides, right? Particularly genocide against the Jews. Many argue that there was a genocide against Ukrainians in the 1930s during the famine under the Soviets. So again, the term genocide carries a lot of, I think in any part of the world, carries a lot of moral weight, but that is not what's going on there's no genocide of Russian speakers in Ukraine, in contemporary Ukraine. That's also just mythology. I think the Lenin thing is to say it more concisely, one of the big reasons that Putin is making this argument that Ukraine has no right to sovereignty is because Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire and then was part of the Soviet Union. So it only existed as a political entity prior to 91 for a very short period during the Russian Civil War. So that political, it had been under the control of a regime in Moscow for much of its history in the modern era. The other part of that history is a little bit more complicated, which is that when the Soviet Union was created, there was, there was an attempt, or not an attempt, there was a national policy was adopted, which encouraged the development of national culture and national languages in the Soviet republics, as long as that culture was sympathetic to sympathetic to the Soviet regime. So essentially, the Soviet Union created, drew the boundaries of contemporary Ukraine, and also encouraged the use of the Ukrainian language, setting up things like schools in the Ukrainian language. Publishing in the Ukrainian language happened, under the Soviet regime, again, kind of the expression of Ukrainian national culture, as long as that culture was not political, was not political, and did not question the legitimacy of the Soviet of communist rule. So some Ukrainian leaders who wanted things like Ukrainian independence, not under a Soviet regime, not under a communist regime, those people were eliminated, arrested, deported, killed, etc. But I think in part Putin is referring to the fact that under the Soviet Union, you did see a state support and endorsement of a type, the development of a type of Ukrainian culture that was in alignment with their political interests. So that's in part what he is, I think, referring to. And yeah, and again, it was a circumscribed type of culture. Soviet national policy is often referred to as national informed socialist in content. So that culture had to be had to be of a certain yeah, certainly had to be in a certain political vein, but it did encourage national cultures. In part, that had to do with the fact that the Soviets saw that the Russian imperial regime had clamped down on national culture, and they felt that it was important to, well, do the opposite of that, to allow people to express their national culture as a way for people to then, in Marx's ideology, to overcome nationalism and then finally identify with a supranational proletariat class-based identity. Marx thought that nationalism was sort of a stage that you had to go through before you saw the light, in essence. So I think that that's, I don't know that that answers your question, but I think that that's part of what, basically what he's saying, I think in what Putin is saying is that Ukraine has existed for most of its history under the aegis of a Russian regime. And even when it did exist as a separate republic, it was the Soviets that kind of encouraged that national culture, in his mind, to their detriment, apparently.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. It has been so great learning from you tonight. I really want to say thank you to everybody that attended as well. If you have a question that didn't get answered, you want to hang out for a minute or two afterwards, we're happy to have you. But otherwise, I just want to give a big thanks to everybody for coming tonight. And again, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that was helpful and didn't just confuse you further, which sometimes happens with me when I'm studying Ukrainian history.
Well, you can understand that there is a lot of unique elements that are important to understand to move forward and have even a better understanding of this. So thank you for giving us the background and then moving forward through the complications, because they are challenging to understand, but better tonight after listening to you. Thank you again, everyone.
It is definitely the case that it's just, I mean, I think it's the case with any conflict, right? When you, or any complicated political situation, when you kind of start looking into the weeds of this, of like what's actually going on here, you're like, oh wow, I did not, all of these other factors come into play that you had not thought about or recognized before, and you get a much better picture of it, but it's also a much more complicated picture. But
Hillary, did you have a question?
No, it's just more of a wonderment about where her family came from in the Ukraine. My grandparents were from Oryn, Oryn, near Kamenets.
oh, okay. Near is that, wait a minute, what was the spelling again?
It was Oryn. It was a small town near Kamenets, Kamenetz.
Is it Kamenets Podolsk?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's my as I mentioned, my father was my father's family is from Ukraine. Well, it's from Kiev. His father, because my paternal grandfather is Ukrainian ethnically, not Jewish. My paternal grandmother was Jewish, and her family, her father, as far as we could tell, came to Kiev from Poland with his brother. I think they were kind of like Bundes type folks, which was the Bund was a Jewish socialist movement. So that was my understanding of what actually happened there, because he was a member of the Communist Party at a very young age. And her mother was from a prominent Jewish family in Kiev. Sorry, let me just. Sorry, just wanted to switch audio there. Her mother's family, her mother was from a prominent Jewish family in Kiev, and that had lived there for several generations. Kiev was not as part of the Pale, or it was within the region of the Pale, but Jews had to have special permission to live in Kiev. And I guess it was my great grandfather apparently was a prominent merchant, and that's how he got permission to live in Kiev. This was my paternal grandmother's mother was one of the siblings of this big family. There was like 7 or 8 siblings. She was one of the younger ones. One of her older brothers was a dentist in Kiev, and it was had an office in the center of Kiev. He had been educated in Germany, so when the Nazis invaded, he said, "Oh no, I can get along better with the Germans than with those Soviets," and he told his family to stay in Kiev, that was a decision that actually many Ukrainian Jewish families made, a fateful decision, and that obviously they most of them perished. My grandmother survived because her father was a member of the Communist Party and worked for the Telegraph and had an opportunity to evacuate his wife and child, and that's how they got out. But most of my my grandmother's mother's family perished. So that's kind of what we know on that side. But yeah, I guess that's interestingly, actually, I have my family has an interesting connection to Minnesota because one member of this family, so one of the brothers was this dentist, but the older brother was fled from Russia in the first few years of the 20th century. We think he fled to escape the draft. He didn't want to serve in the Russian Imperial Army, and he crossed the border illegally, bought a fake passport off of somebody, got on a boat. We think he ended up in Galveston. There was a transport of Jews that were sent to Russian Jews who were sent to Galveston, and went up the Mississippi and ended up settling his family in Minneapolis. So I have cousins in Minneapolis and relatives in Minneapolis from this branch of the family that immigrated in over 100 years ago, 15 years ago or so. And incredibly, he managed to kind of stay in touch with his sister, my great grandmother, and my great grandmother taught my grandmother when my grandmother was growing up. They received packages from this uncle in Minneapolis, and my great grandmother destroyed. I mean, they got like fabric and stuff like that. But my great grandmother destroyed the packaging because there was so much fear about like having uncles in the United States was not a great thing to have in the Soviet Union. Like this was not something that you wanted to publicize. Like, oh yeah, my uncle lives in America. It's great. So she destroyed the packaging because she didn't want anyone to know. But she was so upset that they couldn't thank him for what he was doing, because again, sending a letter to the United States, not a great idea. So she taught my grandmother to memorize the address in Minneapolis that her uncle lived in. So my grandmother, a Russian speaker, was like memorized from a childhood this address in northern Minneapolis, that like, and actually, my father
I mean, we were able to reconnect with that family, and my father later. I mean, they don't live at that address anymore, but my father was actually able to visit that address. Like, oh, it's real, you know. It's this kind of the vicissitudes of Jewish families in the 20th century, the history of Jewish families in the 20th century. That's kind of one of the things that happens.
It is interesting though how it's interesting how the so many places. I went to France and I visited this house that was a house of a prominent Jewish family, and they perished because they couldn't believe that they would be persecuted. They believed that the neighbors would protect them, and all the connections they had, and and the Holocaust Museum, they're just kind of portraying this that for centuries, Jews needed to have permission to do, have a profession or to be somewhere. It's like, I wasn't in the beginning. I missed the beginning, and I wondered if you visited the strategic narrative that I've heard from another person talking about how Putin has this, or the propaganda in Russia has these four points of strategic narrative that they've been laboring and cultivating along. First being the anti-Western and Europe, it's like the binary of Russia being the good and West being evil and trustworthy and fickle and things like that. And then secondly, that that glorification of Russians saving the world from Nazis and kind of because they didn't win the war, so to say, and they lost parts of what they had, they had to figure out a way to turn it into a new narrative. And then that the Slavic nations are all gathered together in Russia, and they are great nations, and of course that's Ukraine as well, and they are the brothers. But then that got turned around with this Nazi thing, they had come too westernized or whatnot, and they actually have betrayed the pact or whatever, and they are now all Nazis or something. So I thought that was very interesting. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I did like I focused, I guess, on two of those narratives, which was the sort of Slavs all need to be together under Russia's lead, and Ukraine as part of that, and the Nazi thing. I think the anti-West argument again is definitely very much a part of that, and I absolutely agree that that's one of the ways that Putin has been legitimizing this war. He and Russia, again, historically has had centuries of discussion and debate and contestation of, are we East or are we West? This has been an obsession within Russian history, or a major focus, a major focus in Russian history, trying to figure out Russia, which sits on the borders between Europe and Asia, and where it kind of belongs culturally. And traditionally, Russia has engaged with the West, certainly more than it has engaged with China, but it doesn't see itself as part of the same cultural, historic narrative. But traditionally, Russia has seen itself in this sort of love-hate relationship with Europe. There's a lot of admiration. There has been historically admiration for European culture, but there is this sense of Russia is different, and in different historical periods, thinkers have advocated that Russia shouldn't try to copy Europe, and Russia should cultivate its own path. This was known as the Slavophilic movement, and Putin, I think, is certainly on that, is pulling on a lot of those narratives. I think that, and then we see this also with this kind of the NATO, the fact that Ukraine was looking to join NATO was one of the sparks for this whole situation, and that Putin has pushed forward this idea that not only are we different from the West, but that the West kind of has it out for Russia, and Russia has to defend itself against the West. And this idea that Russia is vulnerable and is surrounded by enemies, I think, has creeped in, and again is historically been used not just by Putin, but I think it's creeped in really awful ways. I mean, I was communicating with a friend in Moscow, and she doesn't like Putin, hates Putin, has never been a fan of Putin, is not a fan of this regime, thinks that this is awful. But at the same time, her comments echoed this notion of like, well, the West wants to, like, this is going to be an opportunity for Russia to be picked apart by, the West and by China. And this notion that like everyone wants a piece of Russia, and clearly the West is like antagonistic to Russia. And I think that notion has definitely sunk in even among those who are not supporters of the regime. So I think that's and in Putin's statements, it's completely, the West is we have to defend ourselves against Western encroachment, and he has long been he's long been pushing. I think in many ways he's the 20th century, the 19th century thinker. So he's been long pushing a narrative where it's like Russia versus the West, and that Russia, and that goes hand in hand with the notion that Russia can't allow NATO on so close to its borders, or within its fraternal Republic of Ukraine. But
gosh, so much information. I want to be respectful of your time, because we could clearly learn more from you for a long time. I just want to say thank you, and thank you guys for coming. I know somebody just joined us a minute ago, so who knows? You could keep going all night. But thank you.
Right.
Thank you
Yeah.
very
No,
much.
thank you all, and again, I'm if folks have specific questions, they can certainly email me. I'm at the university at UMD, so I'm pretty easy to find. But there's definitely a lot to learn, and it's a very complicated situation. But hopefully things will start going, and hopefully this war will come to some kind of resolution, though it's not clear, I think, to anyone really what that's going to look like, and how that, and whether it's possible in a way that respects the sovereignty and the interests of the people of Ukraine. So it's really kind of tragic. Not kind of, it is tragic. It's for me as a historian, and as an academic, we find ourselves in high demand when something happens in our part of the world, and all of a sudden everyone's like, oh yeah, what's the deal with Ukraine? What's that all about? And on the one hand, you're like, well, I'm happy that people want to learn about this, but I don't want war in this part of the world. So it's sort of like learning about it is great, but I wish we didn't need a war to do that. But
I think that just reminds us that we want quieter days in the future to bring you back and learn more from you again, when we don't have as much conflict to have to be talking about, hopefully.
Thanks again.
Thank you.